First of all, this ridiculous categorization of anybody that has missing time is just sleep paralysis. Anybody that makes that assignment doesn't understand the neuroscience of sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis lasts a couple of seconds.
Welcome. I'm here with Dr. John Blitch. Dr. Blitch, John, okay if I call you that?
Absolutely. Like I said, I answer anything with 4 letters.
Exactly. All right. So welcome. All right. For folks who may have not seen your interview with Ross Coulthard on News Nation, just a very brief background about who you are, where you've been, what you've done.
Okay. So essentially grew up in the suburbs of Boston. You'll hear that accent come out every now and then.
Whereabouts in Boston?
A little town called Peabody. And so you can tell immediately the folks that grew up in the Boston area with the accent.
Peabody. Yeah, it's spelled Peabody, but anybody who comes outside would call it Peabody, but you use it Peabody.
So Peabody.
Right.
So somebody says Peabody, they've never.
It's not right. Yeah, it's not right. It's Peabody. I'm just saying. When Peabody, my wife is from the town of Harvard, Massachusetts.
Harvard, yeah.
Harvard in the cap, yeah. But not the university, but the actual town with all the apple orchards and whatnot. Right. So I don't know where that is relative to Peabody, but I just know there's the Peabody Museum. That's how I know to pronounce it properly. It's next to Leominster.
Yeah, so you can tell a Bostonian, just have him read a map, right? Worcester, Gloucester,
Worcester,
right? Worcester, Gloucester, Leominster, right? Or Dedham, right? So it's hilarious. But yeah, so Peabody, which was right next to Salem, which is, of course, world famous for witch trials and so forth.
Okay. All right. So you're born. Sorry, I didn't mean to throw you off.
No worries.
All right. So you're born in Peabody, Massachusetts. Then what?
No, I wasn't born there. I was raised there. I was born in, interestingly enough, next to a nuclear reactor in Idaho Falls, Idaho, and then bounced a couple places, and then went through grade school, high school, and so forth in Peabody. And so from there, was blessed enough to have some wonderful parents and a fabulous family life, and ended up doing well enough in school and in sports to get an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Graduated from there in 1981. I was not a good student. I set a record for the highest number of demerits before Christmas of plebe year. So highest demerits.
Speaking of plebe year, how was the Cal?
Oh, look at you. You got some insider training information there. Well done.
I almost went to West Point. I had an appointment. Really? I had an appointment, and I decided to come to California instead.
So arguably you were the smarter of the two people on the screen here, for sure.
No, it has advantages and disadvantages. Like, I took all this math in high school. I had gotten to differential equations. I was taking it at a local university. And when I went up there, I would have had to start all over again. I'm like, and waste 2 years of being ahead. It doesn't make any sense. So,
one of the fascinating things about the Service Academy environment, not just there, but when I went back to teach at the Air Force Academy, they were clearly scraping the bottom of the barrel there, right? To have an Army teaching, Space Zoomy folks. The amazing thing is that there's such a fabulous cross-section of America, right? Because every state has their nominees. So you end up in a very, very unique environment where you are forced by hook or by crook to have roommates from all over the country.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Baen Books at Baen.com.
And what I took away from that was different parts of the country had different skill set emphasis. So I was really fortunate in some aspects, but I was struggling in others. And I'll never forget it. We had a couple of kids who, as plebes, as freshmen, they were teaching electrical engineering to juniors and seniors because where they grew up, they got that background.
What part of the country was that?
Yeah, I don't want to get into that because I don't want people from various states slashing my tires, coming out. But there are parts of the country where there's huge variance in where, in high school education. So that was my deal. And then with the 2.41 GPA, they put me in charge of nuclear weapons, right? Go figure, How's that for military intelligence, right?
That throws me off whenever I hear people saying he's the GOAT, right? It has an entirely, and look, I didn't even go there, but it has an entirely different meaning. Like, you know who the GOAT was? Pickett was the GOAT, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So it's basically for folks. Go ahead. You could say what it means.
Yeah, it's a world famous Civil War general, right? Pickett's charge.
But that just means he was last in his class. He's ranked last in his class.
Right.
They're the GOAT. Right.
Yeah, and the tradition is everybody gives the last guy to graduate in the class a silver dollar because he has the least chance of getting promoted early, right? And so you're trying to compensate him, at least give him $1 or $2, right? So our GOAT happened to be another guy from Boston I knew really well, great guy. And I ended up he was one of my Ranger buddies.
Was he from Southie? That seems like a Southie kind of
guy. Yeah, he's a hockey player. And,
was he from Southie? Are you serious?
I don't want to go any further. No, I don't want to go any further. Maybe he will come forward someday. He's a great dude. Great dude.
Lucky guess, I guess. Anyway,
there you go.
Nothing against Southie. Southie's a kind of a rough and tumble kind of Irish town, right?
Tough kids. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And hockey players are tough by nature, right? Because this was, 70s. I mean, still no helmets, right? I think helmets came in when I think it was our senior. I didn't play hockey in high school, but I ended up playing later on down the line. And yeah, face mask and everything. And everybody's like, a bunch of wussy boys. Come on, where's your teeth? You should not have any teeth as a hockey player. Just kind of gets taken away from you early on. So anyway, yeah.
For context, if people watch Good Will Hunting, that's Southie.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. All right, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt. I keep taking us on these.
No worries. So yeah, I ended up as an artilleryman in Germany. And I remember practicing launching our nuclear cannonballs from West Germany into East Germany. And I had a big sort of an epiphany at one point. I was carrying a little cassette recorder and I was walking the gun line, super cold in Grafenwehr, Germany. Anybody that's been, especially tankers, right? They know how bone chilling it is there. So I had this kind of it was like 2:00 in the morning, kind of a weird experience where all of a sudden the blizzard stopped and the clouds opened up, big full moon. And I get this realization that, what the hell are we doing? This is ludicrous, right? The half-life of these explosions that we're practicing launching. First of all, these are two people that speak the exact same language, have exactly the same culture, and they have this artificial fence, the Iron Curtain that came down between these two halves of this country. And it just seems insane, right? Once you step back, if you have some sort of natural awakening moment, you realize, my God, what the hell are we doing?
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
So I decided right then and there, I need to get the hell out of this nuclear weapon stuff. This is ridiculous because I'm not just killing somebody I can't see. I'm killing their kids.
Future generations.
Yeah. Their kids. Yeah. I'm poisoning this entire area here for what? I mean, it just didn't. So anyway, so I wanted to try to become a helicopter pilot. I always wanted to be an astronaut, but my eyes weren't good enough to make it into flight school. So I used some corrective lenses. I thought I had established my Kobayashi Maru because I found the loophole in the regulation. And I used these hard contact lenses, progressively hard contact lenses, to flatten the cornea of my eye, and I passed the test. But it was a two-part test. You do the first, with the optometrist or the eye doctor, and then he said, okay, come back next week, and we'll do the final part of it. So the final part is the psychoplegic exam where they dilate your eyes, and then he gets in there and he actually measures the shape. And so I'll never forget it. He said something like, he's looking in there, and he goes, huh. And I was like, oh, is that a good huh or a bad huh? And he chuckles a little bit, and he says, I think we're still good, but I just need to go check something. And so he caught me. And it turned out that the shape of my eye, he could measure that it was like a football, typical myopia, right? And so the correction was just on my cornea, the very tip of the eye, that was flat. And so the shape of the eye was not creating the correct vision, the flattening of the cornea, and he couldn't see any scarring. So the only limitation at that point was if you cut on people used to do with the keratotomy, if you cut on your eye, immediately disqualifying, because if you get up to altitude and you suddenly have a decompression, that can weaken. There's a guy named Beck Weathers on Mount Everest who had that happen, and it blinded him, almost killed him. So another story, there's the movie Everest that has Josh Brolin, I think plays him. Anyway, so that was a big deal. So, but I found the loophole. And so he comes back and he goes, well, you almost had it. And I was like, oh. Because I told him what I did, because the honor code doesn't stop at the front gate, right? So when he said that, and he said, yeah, shape your eye and everything, I said, okay, well, here's the deal, doc. I've been using these hard contact lenses to reshape my cornea. And he was like, I was all about it, man, because as long as you make it to Fort Rucker and get through that eye exam that they give you, and as soon as you complete your first day of training, if they find your eyes to be bad and they prescribe you glasses after that, you're still good, because I didn't know that. Yeah. They spent all that money to bring you there, right? And once you started training, if you get 1 hour of training, then the policy was, and you stay. And so there were guys that I knew, maybe it wasn't like while they're in flight school, but I knew guys that had glasses. I'm like, dude, why are you a pilot and I'm not? That ain't right, man. Right? So anyway, so he plops this book on my lap, and I'm still in the chair. And he goes, yeah, just read that last paragraph. And it said something to the effect that if you find any reason that you believe the candidate's eyesight to be temporary in any way, shape, or form, you must disqualify. And I was like,
so he got you on that, yeah.
And he was like, the guy almost had tears in his eyes. He goes, and he's like, high-five me. He goes, I thought you had it. But my hands are tied. So that was it. So anyway, long story. And then I applied to naval aviation. After I got to Fort Sill for the advanced course, I applied to naval aviation, and I made it through that. I had orders in my hands. I had baptized my daughter. I got the one NFO slot out of 14 for that year. I baptized my daughter in Pensacola Bay. I met the commander of Naval Flight. This was my celebration tour. So I went right to Fort Rucker and shook hands with all my buddies, all the naval aviators or the Army aviators. And I'm like, puffing my chest up. I'm going to be a freaking fighter jock, Hilo guys. I'm going Mach freaking whatever. And so, it's just the yin and yang of life, right? And I had to pay for that bravado, because when I finally got done with my 30 days leave and came back, we packed everything up. My wife and I, it took us about a week or two, and the movers were coming on Monday. And I'll never forget, Tony Nemechek calls me on Sunday and says, I got bad news. And so they revoked my orders. Now, how from your military background, that's not a common thing. Mm-hmm. If you got orders in hand That's like you're 2 Sigma. You're like 97% there. So I was that 3%.
Why did they yank your orders?
Say that again?
Why did they yank your orders?
Oh, it was 1986. The Graham-Rudman bill had hit, and so it was a cost-saving budget, right, cut.
It was a downsizing, right?
Yeah, so they cut the Naval Aviation Inter-Service Academy or inter-service transfers from 14 down to 7. So out of those 14 slots, there was only one backseater slot, and they were desperate for pilots. That's the only reason they were asking for people from the Army and the Marine Corps and the Air Force if they want to come to the Navy. And so obviously they're not going to keep the one NFO slot. They need pilots. So I went by the wayside. So it was just bad luck. But I got to tell you, I did not watch the movie Top Gun for like 10 years because that came out in 1985. It came out right after I had submitted my packet. So I wasn't going to watch the movie until I arrived in Pensacola for training. And so I went there, obviously, met the commandant, and he said, I guess, welcome aboard, whatever. Army Ranger guy, what the hell? And never went back. So I never watched the movie. I had to get pretty drunk to watch that movie.
Was this after you kind of did your, I don't even know what they, in field artillery, I know you command a battery when you're a captain. What do you do before that? A section or when you're a lieutenant?
No, typically you start out as an FO, a FIST.
Forward observer.
Observer team. For some reason, I ended up skipping that. I was never a forward observer. I went straight to a firing battery. And that's how I went straight into nuclear stuff because we had to start practicing that. So I was a fire direction officer, then an executive officer. And I didn't come up on the command list until after this Navy transfer was revoked.
Okay.
And so that was a problem. And my boss, my battalion commander, was furious that he still ended up giving me a Pershing II missile battery command. So that was my second nuke tour. And he said he would give me a battery command, but I had to pull my inter-service transfer to do it out of loyalty to him. And I was like, sir, I got to see this thing through. I got to see if it works. And so it went through, and he was pissed, but there was nothing he could do, right? Because the Department of the Army said this guy's going to the Navy. But then when it got chopped, I had to go work for that guy, and it did not go well. It was
my God.
It was a rough time. So anyway, that's how I ended up getting into special ops. Is the unit had a recruiting thing where they went around to every Army base, and that's how I ended up going into that. They turned me down at first. They said, you got to go do regular SF first. So I did. And then I reapplied and made it in. And then I had a couple of commands in the special mission unit world. And then from there to graduate school. And then from there to SOCOM and DARPA. And then I retired in 2001 from the Army.
Okay. All right. And let's talk about some of your, call it experiences. It's called anomalous experiences because I don't know what I still don't know what to think about all this stuff yet.
Yeah. The weird woo-woo stuff, right?
Whatever you want to call it. I wouldn't look, there's something, it is real. I don't pretend to know what, it's nuts and bolts, it's metaphysical, like it's probably a mixture of both, whatever it is, right?
Yeah. So the nuts and bolts of it, and that's what Ross kind of wanted to hear, was the bruises on the inside of my arm because, first of all, this ridiculous categorization of anybody that has missing time is just sleep paralysis. Anybody that makes that assignment doesn't understand the neuroscience of sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis lasts a couple of seconds. It's when you're pulled out of your deepest stage of sleep. So you got like 4 stages of sleep. The deepest, REM sleep, which is typically when you have negative. So what you do when you sleep is you're rehearsing the day's activities. Everybody does this. We know this from rats and we know this from humans, that we rehearse the day's activities as a mechanism to consolidate our memories. And it makes sense evolutionarily, right? Because it's really, really important for you to remember how long a saber-toothed claw is. right? It's really important to remember what they smell like. It's really important to know what their scat looks like, right? So if you're going to team up with your 5 other guys with your spears to try to take on a saber-tooth, that's really important stuff, right? So the emotional content of your buddy Jimmy or Steve, who got killed with one swipe by the saber-tooth,
it's prioritized.
You really need to remember that. So
right.
you don't screw that up. You don't make the same mistake they did. And, it's really important to remember what that cute-looking girl smelled like as well, right? So if you're going to propagate the species, and if you're going to survive all the threats out there, the super strong negative emotions and the super strong positive emotions, you need to remember that every single day. So you need to reinforce those. So what happens is when you're sleeping at night, pretty much as soon as you close your eyes, your memory starts consolidating. You start rehearsing what you did during the day. And so if you scored a goal, first time you scored a goal, right? Or first time you hit a home run in your life, man, you need to remember that, right? Or the first time you got in a fight or whatever. So I used to do this exercise with my cadets, and I'd ask them, close your eyes. I want you to remember the first time you had a kiss with somebody or somebody stroked your hand or whatever, and think about all of the details, everything you can imagine. And I'm talking it through them almost in a hypnotic voice, right? And okay, open your eyes and write down everything you can remember. And they would fill a page, right? And then I would tell them, okay, close your eyes. On the back of that piece of paper, I want you to write down, think about the first time you were in a fight, right? Blah, blah, blah. Same thing. They would fill out the whole page. Okay, yeah, take out another piece of paper and think about the mess hall last Thursday and what did you have for lunch, right? And they write like a sentence or 2 sentences. And they can't give me any of the details. They can't give me any of the conversation that they had, none of the context, because it's important for you to forget. It's important for you to forget stuff that isn't essential to procreation or survival or learning, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, the reason I bring all that up is that sleep paralysis occurs in the deepest stage of that when you're woken up involuntarily, a crash or something happens, right?
Yeah, so you don't hurt somebody involuntarily or hurt yourself.
Yeah. Yes. And typically in that stage of sleep, what you're doing is you're dumping all the negative stuff. You really don't want to hold on to all the negative stuff unless there's a deep lesson in it, right? That you don't want to forget. But all the other negative stuff, who called you, mean or whatever, you want to let that go because optimism is crucial for survivability, right? If you don't have a big ego, if you don't have a certain level of confidence, you're never going to leave that cave, right? If you're a female, you're never going to leave the cave to go pick berries or whatever. Or maybe you're part of the hunting party if you're a huntress or a tigress or whatever. And if you're a guy taking on that saber tooth, you got to kind of feel bolstered, right? And so while you're trying to sort out those memories in that deepest stage of sleep, that's the memories that is typically negative affect. And you're trying to let those go. So if somebody wakes up in those deep stages of sleep, there'll be a negative affect. So there'll be a little moment, a moment of terror, but it's not a terrifying paralysis. The reason you're paralyzed is because you're trying to focus your brain internally and let the body rest, right? And so there's a little bit of that latent neurotransmitter blanket, right? You just got to break through that. And then you're fine. So yeah, it might be terrifying for a couple of seconds, but it doesn't last 5 freaking hours. So all these people that are talking about hours of missing time where their family members, their spouse, their teammates, how come Steve didn't get on the bus? Crap. All right, fan out. Let's go look for Steve after the football game or after the soccer, whatever. Steve or Lydia or whoever it happens to be, and they search for hours and they don't find them. So everybody gets back on the bus. They go back to the school. Coach calls the cops, and then they get back to the school, and still no person. And then 5 hours later, or in Travis Walton's case, 5 days later. And he is brought back, he arrives, and he has growth about like maybe a little bit less than yours, right? So sleep paralysis is a absolutely scientific, ridiculous explanation for these events. So on my event, I was gone on a bike ride for a minimum of 5 hours, maybe even longer. And it was to the point that my wife and my daughters went searching up and down the ridgeline for me, couldn't find me, and they get home and they call the cops. And so at the end of that terrifying bike ride, that shouldn't have been terrifying at all, but it was, and a cop brought me home, right? So that's that independent corroboration of anomalous behavior, anomalous activity that this literature over here is full of. So this side of my home office that's obviously still under construction, one of these days we'll get it finished up. This is all the paranormal library over here. And this are all my textbooks, my dad's textbooks. And what I'm finding is these are really starting to overlap a lot. So this side is full of missing time episodes that sleep paralysis cannot explain in any way, shape, or form. People gone for hours, if not days, and having, you mentioned nuts and bolts. The nuts and bolts of the abduction phenomenon that I asked about at the Soul Conference are scars, bruises like mine. Sleep paralysis doesn't give you bruises. And why would it be 3 on one arm in a weird, I don't know of any way that I can cause that. And there's no shallow 3-point, I guess I could jam my arm into a tripod, set up in a shallow, it just doesn't make any sense. Why not on this arm? And I went through my head, what did you do at the gym last night, for crying out loud? Well, I wasn't at the gym the previous night. I had a mountain bike ride earlier in the day or whatever. And there was a lot of other circumstances associated with that. But that's what I cannot scientifically dismiss, that I have 5 hours of missing time on a mountain bike in the middle of the afternoon, and I woke up with those 3 weird bruises on another event. So those 2 events I cannot scientifically dismiss. Everything else I can dismiss as dreams, right? And I want to dismiss that as dreams. And the vast majority of folks in this library and in John Mack's library, so the folks that I asked that question of, that you mentioned in the Soul Foundation last November, that was Karen Austin, or Karen Austin. That's how she pronounced her name, Karen Austin. And she has taken over. She was an experiencer herself that John Mack treated. And then she pretty much took over his life. She was the last person to see him alive. She was the last person to, there were other people that saw her at the conference. Anyway, so she has taken over the John E. Mack Institute, and she's doing wonderful work down there. And what's really important about that is that those people want to dismiss their experiences like I did. We don't want to believe that it was something like that freaking aliens were taking us. None of us want to believe that. And we go to extraordinary lengths to convince ourselves that it can't be that, until you have these independent corroboration situations that you can't deny, And so, and you got to also wonder, why would somebody pay $300 an hour to go to a psychiatrist if it was sleep paralysis? That doesn't make any sense, right? That makes zero sense. So the very notion that John Mack is a very compassionate psychiatrist was screening these folks. And part of the reason that he went into this is that he was looking for pathology. He thought, as many scientists think, that you're curious, you want to explore what the heck is going on.
You want to help these people.
Yes.
You want to help these people, and you think that they have something you can cure. And it turns out
that was it. And so, I think he coined the term worldview, right? That their worldview changed pretty radically as a result of their experiences, which is really a really interesting aspect of it as well. But he took all of the pathology off the table, because if anybody as kind of his intake process, and Karen really should talk about this. So it would be great for you to interview her if you'd like sometime, if she can.
Yeah, definitely. If you want to make, yeah, absolutely.
So I'll link you up if you'd like. But part of the intake process for John Mack, Leo Sprinkle, and a lot of the certified hypnotherapists out there, Yvonne Smith, Kathy Martin, all these folks, very compassionate, and they take all this pathology off the table. Now, so John Mack, because he was a psychiatrist, he could diagnose and immediately identify schizophrenia, any other mental health issues, and they went into a different bin, and he would send them to a specialist to deal with that, right? So what you had after all that is this core of clearly anomalous people with anomalous experiences that don't make sense. And so that was his conclusion, and it's been the conclusion of many other folks. Another very prominent scientist who has studied this at length from within the cognitive psychology world is Dr. Don Derry, Donderi. He's written a couple of books. He did a fascinating experiment where he had a control group, and then he had a group of independently corroborated experiencers with these anomalous missing times. And then he had a really interesting group where he had them, watch science fiction movies and read books and try to come up with a storyline as if they were abductees. So they were the posers. Mm-hmm. And he statistically separated all three of those groups, and the graphics are very compelling. So when you assign statistical error to each one of those, there is no overlap at all. And the groups, when you do a dot plot, are these very clear clusters. So people listening to your podcast, listening to my interviews and so forth, even if they try to pretend that they are abductees, they screwed up. They miss critical components of it.
So how would he measure that? He would just kind of have some sort of neutral observer that was double blind. These people would come in, they would be interviewed, or they would fill out forms or whatever. What was the methodology is what I'm trying to get of the...
Yeah. So I would love you to talk to him and bring him on your show to talk through that whole methodology. But it was essentially just what you talked about. Everything you can imagine to take a confound off the table is what he put into that study to control those variables. And it's essentially a Q&A process, but the Q&A process was kind of kept a bit secretive, right? Because you can't advertise what right. all the critical... So this is another thing, winding back to our initial discussion about special operations, right? One of the things that made our psychs so effective at putting teams together was that they would give their assessments at like 10, 11 o'clock at night after you've been carrying a rucksack all day, right? And so the average person, if you give them a psychological battery of surveys or whatever, at 10 o'clock, you've had your coffee and donuts, and you have enough mental energy to anticipate what they're going to ask. And so you really want to ask your answer, you want to answer B, but you think they want D, so you answer D. Well, 10:30 at night after carrying a rucksack and you're starving, you're going to answer B just to get it done. And then they'll give it to you again and again and again. And so the vast majority of psychological batteries never get a second look, and they're done in comfortable situations, so you don't get down to that. So you can have that discussion with Don, but the results that he showed were very, very compelling. That even if you try to pretend that you're an abductee, it's not the same storyline. And so those data plots were essentially scores on answers to all three. So very compelling scientific evidence, I guess, for me. So so those were my two big threshold experiences. Many others, 10, 15 very anomalous situations that, because there was no independent corroboration, it was just me and the street light as I'm walking under it, and it goes out, and I get on the other side, and it comes back on. Now, I will say that was independently corroborated on one occasion by my wife at the time, because I think she was at Goodwill, and she was coming one way. I was walking from Harvard Freight, and we are going to meet. I had to do something, so I dropped her off to donate some stuff, and then I went to pick up some tools. And so we were going to meet in the middle and go to dinner, and she was walking towards me, and I'm approaching an intersection with a street light. The lights are on everywhere, all up and down the same street. And as I come to that corner, the street light goes out. And so I look up and I'm like, all right. I walk across, and then I keep walking, and then she's looking at me. And then as I get maybe, 25 yards on the other side, the light comes back on. And she goes, "Did you see that?" I'm like, "See what?" She goes, the street light. I was like, "Yeah, it happens, whatever." She goes, "No, that's weird. That freaking light went off when you came under it and turned back on the other side." But that's not significant enough, right? That's not 5 hours of missing time.
Have you had any instances, again, I'm just going to make the contentions for people, somebody who just never watched my channel, knows nothing about this stuff. If you read all the books that are on your right, you're going to find, and I'm not saying this is true, real, whatever, but you will find, if you were to plot it all, incident by incident on a chart, you would find a very high correlation between instances of experience, right? So you can call it nuts and bolts, whatever. But there's also this high strangeness effect. You can call it paranormal, you could call it whatever. So what you described could be described by, there could be a physical explanation for it, could be quantum mechanical, who knows, right?
Sure.
With that in mind, have you had any precognitive events that may have been associated with this?
Yeah.
I don't even know if it's associated with the phenomenon. I think it's something we all can, if you start writing down your dreams, you're going to start getting some weird hits. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. I'm not going to, one of the problems that we've got to deal with, and there's an overlap between special ops and the woo-woo side, right, is ego. And part of the problem with a lot of this is, as if you train yourself as a remote viewer, if you train yourself as a psychic, if you train yourself as a medium, you start to feel like you got kind of a superpower, right? And you got to be really careful about that because of any number of aspects. If nothing else, you could find yourself descending down that vortex of megalomania.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I've interviewed former or just remote viewers who were part of the Stargate program, the DIAs. And one of the people I interviewed actually struggled with that because he went back to a conventional army unit. And
I'm well aware of him. He wrote a book called Psychic Spy. His name is David Morehouse. He was an Army Ranger.
Yep.
Is that who you were talking about?
Yep.
See, now look, I just read your mind, right?
Well, Psychic Warrior, but
Psychic Warrior. See what I mean, though? That's what you got to worry about, right?
Yeah.
So that's just a freaking coincidence,
Right. Right. It's like I read your mind with Southie. I just knew.
Yeah. So this is where you really got to be careful, right? Is you can sideslip into that. But I believe David had some much, much more powerful things happen to him, and that was problematic. But yeah, so I know he talked about a lot of...
Yeah, when he went back into the 82nd Airborne, he had that sort of exactly what you're talking about, but he could also see through, you have that enhanced intuition to see through some of the bullshit, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's hard.
Yeah, it is. But it also can be an asset as long as you rein in the ego, right? So there are warnings, there's countless stories of the point man just having that intuition, and you decide to take the third turn instead of going hard left. And it turns out, IED, big ambush, VEB, IED, whatever. So lots of that. But you've got to bolster it with some science. Otherwise, it can really mess you up, I think. That's just my perspective.
Well, there's also, we don't know, we really don't, well, maybe somebody does deep within the government, but people on the outside really don't know what the mechanism is by which this stuff works, right? So let's say you talked about mediumship, for instance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who's in charge, right? Who's providing? There have been instances where people would always be giving the right answer, and you develop a trust with whatever entity, whatever who knows, right? And then they get you, right? They'll do something catastrophic, the whole trickster thing. So you have to be pretty humble, exactly as you're saying, because we really don't know what we're dealing. We talk about, I think we talk about you're associated with you vetted Jake Barber, for instance. So putting that aside, if you talk about this CE5 thing, right, what are you conjuring? What are you really summoning, right? Is it all light and love? Does it matter kind of what your current energy level is, like low, high, frequency, whatever? Is it just whatever just happens to be passing by in the ether? You get something that's the opposite of light and love, and maybe the whole thing's just not real. Maybe it's just people are convincing themselves. So it requires a level of discernment. I think this is why in the Kabbalistic traditions with the Zohar, right, they tell you, usually I think in that tradition, they don't recommend that you study it until you're grounded. You've had a family, you're kind of in your 40s or 50s. Otherwise, it can drive people insane. So anyway, I took us way, 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 way out into the woo. But like I said, the more you learn about this stuff, the more you're like, no idea.
Yeah. So I want to go back and qualify my answer to you. I think the term you used is precognition. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I might have had a little bit of that, but that wasn't the strongest aspect of it. And it may just be, well, let me come back and address the science of it.
It seems like in your case, the example you gave is more psychokinetic, right?
Maybe, I don't know, but the science of it, the structural evidence, it's not just data, it's actually evidence, to use the Gary Nolan's distinction between those, which I love. But here's a Nobel-nominated scientist saying that the group that he was told that were experiencers and Havana syndrome, and as I understand it, though, they were able to dissociate that. That's a critical term, dissociation, that you have to be able to scientifically, take this blob and put them in two different bins, had enlarged caudate putamen areas. And so that area, this intuition of, knowing, go right, instead of going left because that's where the ambush is. You don't know there's an ambush. You just feel this, that's that part of the area, or that's that part of the brain, right? So neuroscience to the rescue here, that there seems to be something to it. And then, of course, we can talk about the telepathy tapes, which have exploded now in awareness across the internet, which I think is fabulous. Because as I understand, Dr. Brown, who, started all this, she was horrifically treated initially, similar to John Mack, right?
Yeah, they were contemporaries, right?
Yes, absolutely. And so I'm getting goosebumps. I love that science is coming around to start validating these, right? That we're seeing this. So like I said, the woo is getting really close to this. And it's because we have tools that we didn't have. John Mack didn't have half the neurological tools that we have. I'm right over there. I got 5 wireless EEG sets sitting on that shelf waiting for me to put on somebody's head to start monitoring.
Like theta waves and...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I used it primarily for assessment of disengagement for drone operators. So, and we can talk about that some of the time, but the tools like that I was able to purchase for like $20,000, that was not reachable in the mid 90s, and so now this stuff is coming back around. And so I think we're really getting close to really exploring scientifically with very compelling data and evidence and findings that telepathy is real, that we can discover things about each other. And I will tell you from evidence that's not in either of these, in relationship to the use of grill flame, which was the predecessor
project to
Stargate, right? I have had several people, plank holders at the unit, tell me that the grill flame data for Operation Eagle Claw, which is now known from, as you pointed out, the Iran hostage failed mission there, that stuff was spot on, absolutely spot on. And I remember these guys telling me back during my time. So I got there about 10 years later, right? 79, 89. And that still sits very heavily with me. So if there was something, if it was that valuable, you think they really shut it down?
No, of course they didn't. Of course they didn't. What I would be interested in, and again, it's probably not going to come out, not only if that worked, right? That was working in the 90s. What else have they innovated since then?
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support, because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and you can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much, and keep watching. I really appreciate it.